my topic is green public procurement and small and medium-sized enterprises, financial strengths. What is the relation between it? So this is something or a little different from what we discussed so far. I give you the agenda. I should say this is part of an European Union project in the Horizon 2020 framework, and it is also a project that tries to bridge academia and practitioners or practice. We are more on the academia part, but we have a lot of cooperation partners which do more practical things. So, and all is about public procurement, sustainable public procurement. So my agenda for the presentation is first the background and the research question, then I go over previous research. I describe the sample and the empirical approach, and then I discuss the results and draw conclusions. So what is the background? From 2050 to 2070, EU public authorities spend approximately 2 trillion euros annually, about 40% of GDP, on the purchase of services, works, and supplies. Green public procurement has only a small share of in this expenditure, but it is expected to grow considerably in the coming years. If the EU awards these offers that protects the environment more effectively than conventional variants, then the public authorities in the European Union contribute, or its purchasing power contribute to the great green transition, which we are heading to, hopefully. And firms that compete for the green procurement contracts and the financial institutions that fund these applicants are the mediators in this process. Against this background, we raised two research questions. The first is, does financial strength affect the likelihood of winning a European Union tender in general and of winning a green public procurement tender in particular? And we go after these research questions with a probed panel data approach. And the second one is, does winning a public procurement tender promote a firm's financial strength? So is the firm afterwards more able to access external funds? And for this, we use a flex panel difference in difference approach. Flex panel, I come to the term flex panel later on. So now, this is, and my third slide. So previous research, renewable energy supply is to a large extent related to innovations, and funding possibilities for innovators are usually constrained. So the environmental innovation projects have very long-term commitment, and it is often associated with immature and complex technology. So this makes funding difficult. There are long payback periods, so the investment risk is very high. Innovative firms own often fairly large stocks of intangible assets that cannot be pledged as collateral, which is also a funding obstacle. So also opaqueness and information asymmetry between borrowers and investors are particularly problematic for SMEs. Those obstacles are even more prominent for environmental innovation projects. Accordingly, the immaturity of renewable energy supply markets, a greater perceived risk of the investment in environmental innovation, fierce competition from fossil fuel-affine incumbents, and an insufficient recognition of climate risk in rating models, including the bank's own internal models, work in favor of funding constraints and induce financial institutions to shy away from supplying the required funds. The public procurement has a potential to stimulate firms' innovation. So public procurement could have a prominent role in stimulating firms' innovation. And innovative public procurement also has a crucial role in improving innovation success, measured in terms of turnover that is already found in 2 studies. Another study found that awarding a tender has a positive effect on stock returns. The main benefit of green public procurement is the ability to be a demand pull factor and market trigger to enlarge the market for environmentally friendly goods and services. The access to public funds and fiscal incentives contribute to improve the firm's ability to introduce eco-innovations as firms consider public funding to be complementary to other external funding. So this is a kind of a de-risking instrument. The access to external finance depends on the firm's creditworthiness, and gaining a contract award in publicly procured tenders may contribute to strengthen the creditworthiness of renewable energy supply innovators and improve the access to borrowing. So this is basically our hypothesis, that we believe that gaining a contract award in a public procured tender tournament strengthens the creditworthiness of innovators and improve the access to borrowing. So now to our sample. So we use the tender electronic database of the European Union and the Amadeus firm database. These 2 sources are the basis for our empirical assessment. TED is the public procurement database of the European Union, and it contains contract award notices, and this contract award notices can be boiled down to the winning firms. If we have identified the TED winning firms, then we match financial data to those firms from Amadeus. And then we have the TED winning firms and the financial data from Amadeus. And now we would want to have control firms. And of course, the participating firms, the other bidders that failed to receive a contract award would be the ideal candidates for the control firms, but those information is not necessary, is not there in the TED beta database, unfortunately. So we apply a magic technique. So we construct artificial control firms via this matching technique. So we select control firms from the Amadeus database. And these control firms did not receive a contract award, but were similar in key indicators to the successful firms in the year prior to the contract award year. So, and because of this similarity, it qualifies as suitable control firms. What we have is we have noted firms of around 6,000 firm years in the sample, and we have these are the matched Amadeus firms, which are similar to our TED successful firms, and we have 6,300 firm years from the TED firms. In 2014, the European Union introduced a change in the database, and therefore we cannot use earlier observations than 2015. So our contract award period starts in 2015, and we observed there are 260 firms, and then the years on, our observation periods ends in 2018, and the distribution of firms is rather equally distributed across the years. And the firms are from 10 countries. Which are participating in this European Union project. So what are our financial strength indicators? We have the equity ratio, that is shareholder funds divided by total assets, then long-term debt ratio. These are the non-current liabilities divided by total assets. Then the short-term debt ratio, so this is the sum of loan and credits divided by total assets. The loan ratio, these are the loans divided by total assets, and the credit ratio, that are trade credits divided by total assets. And we have also the turnover, which divided by total assets as turn ratio. And we use also size indicators, the log of the total assets, and whether the firm is an SME or not, according to the definition of the European Union. SME is a firm that has less than 250 employees. So the first question is, which we go after, how does the likelihood of winning a tender depend on the firm's financial strengths? And how does the likelihood of winning a green tender depend on the firm's financial strengths? And we define an indicator variable for the profit model, and this indicator variable is 1 if the firm wins any tender and 0 otherwise. The second subsample is if the firm wins a tender and is an SME, and 0 if it is no SME. And the third subsample is if the firm wins a green public procurement, and if the control firm is a similar firm from the matched similar firm from the Amadeus database. And the fourth subsample, among SMEs winning a green public procurement tender, So TED year, this indicator variable is 1 if the firm wins a tender and 0 otherwise. So we have 4 subsamples. 1 and 2 is winning a general tender, and 3 and 4 is winning a tender in the green public procurement area. It is a little difficult to really identify in the TED database what is a green tender. There is the help of the common procurement vocabulary. This allows to identify tenders from the area of green public procurement, but there is also a gray area where you not really can say this is a green tender or it is not a green tender. So it's really difficult to identify and define green tenders. I show you some example of what is definitely green tenders. So tenders related to solar energy, solar panels, wind turbines, wind farms, and so on. So there it is clear that these are really green tenders, but it is difficult in some other areas. So, and now the second question, how does winning a tender affect the firm's financial strength in the years after winning the tender? And here is the financial strength indicators are then the dependent variable. We have a treated group that is the firm that wins a tender, and a non-treated control group. And what interests us is the treatment effect. So this is the interaction between being treated, so having won a tender, and the post-treatment period, so the years after winning the tender. And this treatment effect, if it is significant and positive, then we can say that having won a tender is indicative for the financial strength. Okay, then let's come to the first results. To the profit estimation. Does the financial strength of the firm influence the likelihood of winning a contract award? And the first financial strength indicator we test is the equity ratio, and we see that the equity ratio 1 year before winning the tender has a negative effect on winning the tender. So if you have a high equity ratio, then the likelihood of winning a tender is lower. And this is robust across the sample of all firms, across the sample of all SMEs, across the sample of all firms winning a green public procurement tender, and the sample of only SMEs winning a green public procurement tender. So this is rather, for us, it was at first sight surprising. And we have then the likelihood of winning a tender, a contract award, depending on the short-term debt ratio. And we see that in the sample of all firms and in the sample of all SMEs, it increases the likelihood if your short-term debt ratio is higher. It has no impact in the sample referring to the green public procurement contracts. And the short-term debt ratio is can be disentangled in a loan ratio and in a trade credit ratio. I come immediately to the trade credit ratio. So the likelihood of winning a contract award is higher if your trade credit ratio before the success year is higher. This is for the subsample of all firms, true for the subsample of all SMEs. And it is also true for the subsample of all firms with winning a green public procurement tender. The turnover ratio has no impact on the likelihood of winning a tender, no matter whether it's green or whether you are an SME, no impact. And and this brings me to our second research question. The success is the treatment effect that I win a tender. Does this have any impact on my financial strength indicator? And I show you two financial strength indicators, the equity ratio and the short-term debt ratio. And you can see here that the treatment effect is negative for all firms, and it is negative for all firms in the subsample of green public procurement awards. And that means that if you win this award, then afterwards you have a lower equity ratio than the control firms, which is also somehow surprising at first sight. And we have a second difference in reference regression for the short-term debt ratio. And here we see that winning a tender has no impact on the short-term debt ratio for all firms, for the subsample of SMEs, for all firms that have won a green public procurement tender, but it has a negative effect for firms that have won a green public procurement tender and are SMEs. So if you are an SME and if you have won a green public procurement tender, then you have a lower short-term debt ratio than the control firms. So with these two regressions from the difference in difference analysis, I'm able to come to the conclusion first with regard to question 1, does the financial strength affect the likelihood of winning a tender? Here we can say that the equity ratio has a significant and negative effect on the likelihood of winning a tender in traditional tenders and also in green public procurement tenders. What is the explanation for this? One explanation could be that equity-rich companies may fall victim of a fat cat syndrome and exert less efforts in public procurement tenders. The short-term debt ratio has a significant and positive effect on winning a traditional tender. It has no effect on winning a green public procurement tender. The effect may reflect the high liquidity needs of expanding firms. Those firms may be more willing to heavily engage in winning a public procurement tender. So if you have a high short-term debt ratio, that means you have a really high liquidity needs, and that makes you working hard to win a tender. And with regard to the second question, does winning a public procurement tender promote a firm's financial strengths? The success lowers the equity ratio of successful firms, no matter it is in a traditional tender process or in a green public procurement tender. In contrast, the impact of a contract award on short-term debt ratio is only in the sample of SMEs receiving a green public procurement tender significant. So what can we make out of these? In particular, the success lowers the equity ratio of the successful firms. Receiving an award obviously allows those firms to work with low equity ratios. The award may be a substitute for a high equity ratio, and therefore it works in favor of improving the firm's access to debt financing after receiving awards. So this is our main conclusion from our exercises, that the award really is related to low equity ratios, but the award, these low equity ratios, they turn out even after 3 years of having enjoyed the award, because the award itself is a substitute and makes it easier to access debt financing. This was my last sentence. Thank you for your attention. And I'm happy to receive your questions.